My name is Sam Kean. I am a science writer, and my latest book is Dinner with King Tut: How Rogue Archaeologists Are Recreating the Sights, Sounds, Smells, and Tastes of Lost Civilizations.
The surprising efficacy of ancient medicine.
Imagine you were in one of these villages and the Vikings were running wild and they attacked someone that you know and love. They crack their skull with a big axe and they leave them lying and bleeding on the ground. And now it's your job to save them. You have to perform a surgery on them and then prevent that wound from getting infected. It sounds kind of startling to say, but one of the first surgeries that human beings ever performed was a type of neurosurgery called a trepanation. So imagine someone gets hit on the head and their skull craters in and there's bits of bone pressing against the brain. That's a very dangerous situation. You can suffer brain damage, even die from that as pressure and blood builds up beneath the skull. And they would remove those broken bits of bone. That would allow any blood to seep out and would prevent it from pressing down on the brain and injuring the brain. So for the book, I actually got to try a trepanation myself. I used a stone tool for it, like you can see here. It's a piece of flint with some serrations on it. So it was kind of like a sawtooth piece of stone tool. And I tried it out on a deer skull. I essentially cut a triangular hole in the skull and then levered that bit of skull off. You can see right here, that is the piece of skull from the deer, and there's a little bit of skin still adhering to it. And cutting this small piece, it's about the thickness of a bottle cap or so, took me about 90 minutes of work to do. And these were some of the worst 90 minutes that I had doing the book. This was an awful, awful chore. The stone tool actually worked quite well at first. I was surprised at how good it was slicing through skull for a while. Because one disadvantage of stone tools, even though they're very sharp, is that they dull very quickly. They grind down, little bits start flaking off, and eventually you're left with a fairly dull tool where you're just sort of grinding away at it. So after the first cut was completed, this took me a very long time, was a very big struggle. The other thing I didn't expect to happen was that I was outdoors while I was doing it, a very warm day, and flies started coming around. There were flies everywhere. They were in my hair, crawling in my shirt, crawling up my shorts, biting me, swarming all over the wound as I was shooing them away. I was also starting to sweat, and there was blood and bodily fluids coming out of this deer skull that I was working on. It ended up being a gigantic, gigantic frustration for me. But in a way, that was actually a good thing because part of the experience of experimental archaeology is show you some of the frustrations and show you the things that people must have endured in ancient times as well. So one thing you might be wondering with trepanations is, well, didn't people die all the time? I mean, you have a big open wound on your head. You have flies crawling in it. They're going to cause infections. And the answer is people survived a lot more often than you might think. We have lots of examples of skulls with holes in them where you can see new bone growth around the rim of the skull, which proves that the person must have survived this trepanation. And especially in the Viking times, they would have had ways to combat infections. One way was discovered in what was called a leech book. Leech is yield slang for doctor. They would actually use leeches to draw blood off people. And in this leech book, a couple of modern scholars, one a historian and one a microbiologist, found some recipes that they thought might be plausible that would control infections. So they decided to test one. The recipe in the leech book called for a few ingredients: onions, garlic, wine, and what was called ox gall, so bile from the liver of a cow. You had to mix this together in a copper bowl and then let that sit for about a week or so and then use that on an infection. And the book claimed that it was great with infections. It would really, really combat infections. But they wanted to see if that was true because the book had some other unusual recipes in it that didn't sound very plausible to them. So after making this mixture, the microbiologist tested it out in her lab. And she purposely chose two pretty tough bacterial customers. One was staph and one was gonorrhea. And in modern times, both of these bacteria have shown a lot of resistance to drugs. So they're kind of running rampant in some people. It's very hard to control these infections. But it turned out that this mixture of onions, garlic, wine, and ox gall did a really nice job killing these drug-resistant bacteria. She was surprised at how good they were. And in fact, she tried them in another, even tougher test, and they passed this test as well. Sometimes when bacteria get inside you, they form what's called a biofilm. So bacteria, they essentially lock their arms together, and they secrete a mucus that blocks drugs from getting through. So it's a protective barrier that they produce inside living creatures. And these biofilms are actually one big reason why a lot of drugs that show promise in test tubes fail when they try them in living beings. But when they tried this ancient mixture on biofilms, it busted right through and killed the bacteria anyway. She was very, very excited about this because biofilms are very difficult to overcome. And they're actually developing this ancient recipe as a modern drug and moving forward into human trials with the goal of helping us combat some of these drug-resistant modern strains. One nice lesson of this example is that knowledge isn't always linear. I think we have sort of an idea that we're constantly accumulating knowledge, that we knew more than people did 10 years ago, more than 20 years ago, more than a few centuries ago, and certainly more than people knew thousands of years ago. But that's not always the case. Sometimes knowledge does fall through the cracks. And this mixture was a really nice example of that, of something a doctor in the 900s would have immediately turned to, but that people nowadays would not have known unless they looked back. And we should probably give people in ancient times more credit for the real knowledge that they did have. One great thing about experimental archaeology is that it can reinvigorate people's love for the past. If you go to a museum and you start reading the displays, looking at the objects, that's a really nice experience. But that kind of knowledge has a pretty short half-life. It's probably not going to make that deep of an impression on you, and the knowledge will probably seep away pretty quickly. Imagine going to a museum and getting a slice of Roman bread or a quaff of Viking beer. Imagine getting to try on ancient leather clothing or get to hurl a spear at a dummy of a mastodon. It would really enliven the experience and bring it to a whole new level in your mind. And so a lot of people call the field not just experimental archaeology, but experiential archaeology, or even living archaeology, because it really brings the past alive in a new way.
Want to support the channel? Join the Big Think members community where you get access to videos early, ad-free.